May 29, 2015. The dread pirate Roberts, also known as Ross Ulbricht, stands before a court in downtown Manhattan. Accused of creating and running the notorious Silk Road website, he has been condemned as a dangerous criminal mastermind by his critics and lauded as a hero of the digital age by his supporters. He is charged with brokering more than 1 million drug deals through his online black market. The FBI reports seizing 144,000 bitcoins that Ulbricht earned as commission from the sale of illicit wares, worth $1.25 trillion today. Following months of speculation, the jury takes 3 hours of deliberation to find Ulbricht guilty. The court hands down a life sentence to the former dread pirate. He will spend at least the next 30 years in a US prison. And while there is no doubt of Ulbricht's guilt, the FBI caught him in the act, many commentators have been surprised at the vehemence and tenacity with which the US government pursued and prosecuted him. Within the media, commentators talked about Ulbricht in terms usually reserved for terrorist organisations, arguing that Silk Road was a highly dangerous organisation to America and to American values. But could a website that peddles drugs really present the same level of existential threat to American values and safety as extremist organisations? The truth is that Ulbricht presented something far more terrifying for governments than any terrorist organisation or organised crime syndicate ever could. You see, users of the Silk Road website traded entirely through the virtual currency Bitcoin, a currency based on highly independent and secure transfer technology. Along with this, user activity was encrypted by a high-grade security tool known as the Onion Router, or Tor for short, meaning that government regulators were almost rendered powerless to stop the website. And this forced the US government and many commentators to acknowledge a new 21st century reality. When government can no longer control currency, they truly risk becoming obsolete. My name is Chris Shirley, and in the last episode, we explored the ways the digital revolution has impacted conflict in Western societies. In this episode, we're going to look at currency and how digitalization is likely to impact the nature of money in the 21st century. Power and wealth have always gone hand in hand. When studying history, we often become focused on battles and heroic generals, but the truth is, successful empires are almost always driven by a flourishing economy and entrepreneurial success. For example, in the ancient world, Greece rose to power after taking control of the world's olive oil production, while the Roman Empire was heavily subsidized by their control of silver production in Spain. In the more modern context, the British Empire's dominance was largely funded by their control of global sea trade, and the US's control of global oil in the early 20th century funded much of their military might. You see, in most Western democracies, a strong economy provides the government with revenue through taxation, allowing the country to purchase things that would strengthen their position in the global landscape, such as the military, critical infrastructure such as roads and energy infrastructure. Beyond this, economic success empowers governments to improve the quality of life of its citizens by providing social benefits such as health, education, and cultural infrastructure like sporting facilities. And now governments traditionally draw their taxes from a range of sources, but it heavily skews towards 3 main channels: profits from locally based companies, income from the wages of workers, and income from sales or ad valorem taxes such as goods and service taxes. So as you can imagine, governments can become quite protective when it comes to the ways people and companies pay for things. It's critical that governments keep a close eye on these things to ensure they are able to budget and make sure they are being paid correctly. This process is much easier to do when a country uses a central currency, such as the dollar. In contrast, if multiple forms of currency or different ways of trading goods is adopted, it becomes very difficult for governments to collect taxable revenue. Using a central currency also has other benefits. It typically encourages consumers to store their wealth in large public institutions such as banks. And these institutions typically invest that money back into the domestic economy by lending it to individuals, businesses, or infrastructure programs. And this creates a cyclical growth effect, in turn increasing taxable revenue. Beyond this, a central currency allows governments to regulate behaviours within a domestic market by issuing stimulus packages to encourage desirable activities, or fining or increasing taxes on consumers and companies to limit undesirable behaviours. A single central currency is essential if a government is to successfully control and regulate a country. Now imagine a world where governments can't fine people because they simply don't own money. They aren't paid by their employer in cash, their wage isn't stored on shore, and their savings aren't held by a bank. Consumers don't necessarily buy things from companies in their country, and those companies don't pay tax in the country where the consumer lives. Because wealth is not stored in banks or funds, the government has no way of forcing people or companies to pay their taxes, or fines for that matter, without the use of force, which, in an increasingly divided world, may become harder than it sounds. Lucky we don't live in that world, right? Well, not so fast. Increasing consumer confidence in digital channels, coupled with decreasing trust in government-regulated institutions, is leading people to move a significant amount of their consumer activity online. Beyond this, there's an increasingly large number of tools available to consumers which could serve to reduce the need for a government or banks to act as a middleman for consumers when they're making a purchase. And what do we mean by this? Well, in a currency-based system, large purchases are made using a currency that is recognised by three parties: a seller, a buyer, and an overseer. And the overseer is a person or body that verifies transactions have occurred and that the currency that is being traded is equal to the agreed value of the product they are trading. Let me give you an example. Let's say Michael wants to sell his car and he wants to get $10,000 for it. And Rashid agrees to buy the car for $10,000 in cash. Why do both parties agree that $10,000 is the same value as the car? I mean, really, you're just trading a whole lot of paper for a highly advanced piece of technology. And the overseer acts as an intermediary to ensure both parties that the value of the currency which is being traded is worth the same value as the good that is being purchased. That's currency. In addition to this, the overseer verifies that the transaction has taken place, but we'll come back to this in a minute. Traditionally, the value of currency is determined by a central government in conjunction with the global market. When currency was first adopted, it represented a significant evolution from historic feudal systems where people would trade physical goods. For example, Erwin might give Michelle 8 chickens in exchange for 2 cows. You can see the appeal of using a simplified system that doesn't require you walking your cows over to Michelle's farm, right? Trading in currency does present some challenges though. For example, when traders first started using money, they ran into a major problem. Transporting significant sums of cash was expensive and risky. If you're transporting 1 million gold coins to the other side of the country on carts, you're likely to get robbed or worse. To overcome this, traders started using trusted overseers and intermediaries such as banks. And these intermediaries would keep ledgers highlighting how much currency or wealth the person holds, and would safely facilitate large transactions between traders without the need for the physical shifting of currency, essentially removing a lot of the risks associated with currency systems. As we mentioned earlier, having banks hold a majority of wealth also provides governments with a huge benefit. They are able to control the flow of money in a society via a central bank through fiscal and monetary policy. Now, banks also serve a number of other purposes, for example, loans, but that's not the focus of this episode. Over time, banks have needed to respond to various socio-cultural and market changes, but have always maintained their place as a safe, central location where money is held, because they are the safest option available. And people can trust bank ledgers, meaning that trade can happen at a relatively high speed without the need for individual traders to worry too much about security. Until recently, trading on the internet was subject to the same dangers as any traditional currency exchange. You could get robbed very easily. Now, sure, there were some great protective systems out there, such as PayPal, but until recently, they were still a trusted intermediary that protected your cash by maintaining a single protected ledger. The digital revolution is changing this, with massive technological shifts in the currency space. And perhaps the most famous of these at the moment is blockchain, the technology that underpins modern cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Emerging trade technologies such as blockchain and smart contracts have the potential to dramatically change this, however, by removing our need for an intermediary altogether. Blockchain was first discussed by the computer scientist and mathematician Nick Szabo back in the 90s, but it wasn't until recently that it really started being mobilized in a very consumer-minded way. Essentially, blockchain replaces the need for a trusted intermediary to protect your single currency ledger by creating a plethora of ledgers located on computer terminals and servers all across the world. Blockchain is disrupting more than just banks, however. It also has significant implications for security, identity, and medical data storage, as well as many other areas. However, for today, we're just going to be discussing the financial implications of blockchain. We'll talk more about other social impacts in another video later. Now, smart contracts are a slightly different form of technology, which holds the final transfer of digital currency until all prerequisite terms of a contract have actually been met. So why do we bring up blockchain and smart contracts? Well, they're just two of a range of different technologies that are impacting on the traditional way that we trade and engage with currency. Essentially, as technologies like blockchain become more integrated into our everyday lives, it means we're becoming less reliant on having an overseer, such as banks, who control the exchange of currency and maintain a ledger. And the two active parties, that is the buyer and the seller, can usually trust that the blockchain is too large and too complex for the other party to easily defraud. So let's go back to our example of Michael and Rashid. When Rashid pays Michael the $10,000, he's going to want some verification from Michael that he received the payment, such as a receipt. Without a receipt, Michael could simply say that Rashid never actually paid him and that the car was stolen. And this is why the overseer has historically been so important. You are protected from fraud by the word of that trusted intermediary, and this is the ledger. William Mugaya articulated it wonderfully. Controlling currency is a critical aspect of maintaining governance. Essentially, Western democracies and the UN rely heavily on currency to regulate the behaviours of people, countries, and corporations across the globe without using force. In a world where consumers are potentially able to bypass regulators, it would potentially jeopardise the ability of governments to regulate and could undermine national budgets, which are critical for providing services. If we can move beyond the limitations of existing crypto systems, then it is our opinion that it will have several major impacts on democracy in the 21st century. The first of those is the potential impact of a decline in taxable revenue. A number of governments have started taking the risk of digital currency on their domestic budgets very seriously. For example, the US now considers cryptocurrency to be property, meaning it is subject to capital gains tax. And recent tax changes also have provisions related to like-kind exchanges, loss carrybacks, and the treatment of pass-through businesses. And we're not going to explain each of these concepts in too much detail, other than to say they are very deliberate attempts by the government to ensure the trading of cryptocurrency is treated no differently to other investments. And other countries like Australia have similar legal structures, ensuring cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin incur tax penalties if they are traded for goods that are of equal or greater value. The problem is, these laws mostly treat digital currency like investments, stocks, or securities. And that makes sense at the moment, with many investors currently stacking their portfolios with cryptocurrencies like Ethereum and Bitcoin that have grown tremendously in value over the last 5 years or so. But that's not the ultimate goal here. Technologists don't intend for digital currency to be floated on the stock exchange, being bought and sold as investments. They are looking to create a very real replacement for existing central currencies, allowing consumers to transfer money in a cheap and highly efficient way, excluding banks and governments from the process. Even if governments do decide to legislate against digital currencies as a transactional medium rather than an investment, there are several factors that undermine the ability of governments to effectively enforce these laws. Firstly, the use of virtual private networks and other technologies such as Tor mask the identity of users and allow consumers to buy and sell goods with cryptocurrency virtually invisible to governments. So unless people use their digital currency to make large, highly visible purchases, such as property, the government and banks are going to struggle to have the visibility to tax these types of transactions when they are made using a VPN. That being said, you may argue governments could look to force consumers and sellers to pay taxes on purchases made using digital currency by controlling supply. Basically, the government would stop goods being traded unless a certain amount of tax is paid. And this is a practice already done in many countries like Australia with property, where in many states you aren't allowed to transfer ownership of a property without paying what is known as stamp duty, essentially a sales tax. But this is largely only possible where goods are too big to be hidden. If we look back at the example of Silk Road, highly illicit substances were traded across the globe very effectively. So to argue that the government could stem the supply of most goods would seem a little naive. Beyond this, there are a number of new technologies that can potentially make supply lines more transient than at any time in the past. The advent of 3D printing is just one example of a range of technological and social innovations that are reducing the ability of governments to control supply. The sharing economy is another great example, where people are willing to simply share their goods rather than taking ownership. And as such, the government must rely on small-scale service providers, which is the individuals who rent out their cars or their stereo systems, to record their trading behaviours honestly. Again, historical precedents would suggest this is unlikely. For example, in Australia, the Federal Tax Office has identified that up to $25 billion worth of tax is lost each year due to the black economy or businesses that operate as cash only. The Indian government recently removed up to 80% of its physical currency to stop the flow of illicit goods and reduce the impact of the cash trade economy on the government's bottom line. So if countries have this problem with cash, a currency that is physically regulated and backed by central banks, it would be reasonable to assume that a decentralized and crypto-protected digital currency would be even more difficult to control, particularly if 3D printers empower consumers to physically assemble many products in their own home. So governments are left in a situation where they need to find different ways of compelling behaviours in the population. Now, we could just use force, essentially arrest people that don't pay their taxes or fines. But that really doesn't work for two reasons. Firstly, many Western countries such as the US, Australia and England already struggle to keep their justice systems running smoothly. They are highly expensive and jails are already overwhelmed. Increasing those costs just wouldn't be feasible if government budgets were already in decline. Similarly, using force to compel behaviours is a pretty bad way to manage a society. More heavily policed states are historically quite unstable and regularly struggle with civil problems. Now, some crypto investors and technologists argue that declining tax really isn't a major factor associated with digital or blockchain-based currencies. But even if a currency is set up to automatically pay taxes, there is no reason that another blockchain currency couldn't be set up to avoid this. And with increasingly sophisticated VPN and other identity masking technology, it's really quite unlikely that people and companies could be easily found out. So yes, blockchain-based currencies could technically be set up to automatically pay tax as transactions occur. And in theory, this would be substantially more secure and efficient than any tax collection methodologies currently in place anywhere in the world. But I would argue that this type of thinking fundamentally ignores the cultural factors that make digital currencies like Bitcoin so appealing to the average consumer and corporation. They are decentralized from governments and banks. And as we identified earlier in the episode, there is substantial historical precedence with the cash economy to show that people and businesses will not, by and large, pay tax if there is a way to get out of it. So how can governments compel people to pay their taxes honestly in the second half of the 21st century, once digital currencies become more normalized? Well, I would argue that our best way of predicting the future is to look at the past. You see, blockchain is an amazing technology. It offers a huge array of benefits for society and economies as a whole. But we cannot just ignore the sociological aspects of economics. It is fundamentally anti-intellectual to do so. People and corporations have proven time and time again that they will not pay their taxes unless they are compelled to do so. Whatever happens, it will be critical for Western governments to find effective ways to control tax flow in the second half of the 21st century. You see, nations and empires don't typically fall through military exhaustion. Look at Rome. The empire was decimated by foreign armies on several occasions, including the Etruscans, the Celts, the Carthaginians, and the Huns. But the country always quickly returned to its position as a global leader. No, most empires fall when their internal control of wealth and external dominance of global trade becomes undermined. In feudalist Europe, monarchist governments relied heavily on lords and barons to help maintain civil obedience. And part of this was streamlining the workforce by entrusting a geographical region and therefore a section of the economy to these power lords. A regent was able to ensure taxation was undertaken as robustly as possible. In our opinion, it is likely that the second half of the 21st century will see democracies adopt a similar approach by partnering with corporate powerhouses across the globe, and we'll explore this in more depth in the next episode. Join us in our next episode as we discuss the future of sovereignty and the rise of corporate states. We will explore the implications for governments, particularly in the context of a declining reliance on central currencies.